Hi, this is Sebastian, Natural Mystic Pollock, bringing you another video about 3 common HUD mistakes for RakebackDollars.com. First, we're just going to take a look at some of the common mistakes that many players make regarding the HUD, and then we're just going to look at 3 specific mistakes. First, a lot of players that I work with and coach, they rely on the HUD way too much when they're making a decision. Instead of reading the action and reading the play, a lot of players are making their decision based on a HUD stat, i.e., oh, well, this guy was playing a really wide VPIP or PFR, so therefore he was a fish, so I thought I could call here, and, again, or he C-bets a lot, or he does this, or he does that, when the action and the line clearly tells a different story from what the stat says and what the play should be. Again, many players that I work with, they have way too many stats on their HUD, and they don't know what they mean. And along with this, they not only do they have too many stats on their head, but they also don't understand what the stats mean or how the stats work together. Another problem I see is players use the wrong stat in the wrong spot. And I also feel that a lot of players, again, relying on the HUD too much, they make big assumptions based on limited sample size. So somebody may make either a big call down or a big raise or something like that based on a very limited hand sample. Especially I find that players get into trouble when they use their HUDs with limited hand samples, either on later streets or 3-bet pots or things like that, where you really need a much larger hand sample to get an accurate picture. The first big mistake that I see that we're going to look at is players don't use positional stats. They assume that players have the same range from all positions. Also, they make incorrect assumptions based on stats. So we're going to bring over the hand replayer here, and we're just going to take a quick look at this player here, empowered skill here. We'll look at this particular player here. Now, if we were to see this player's stats and say, wow, this guy's 3-betting 77% of the time, then we'd say, oh, this guy's a fairly aggressive 3-better, and he has a fairly wide 3-bet range. But now if we take a look at his 3-bet stats by position, we can see that from middle position and the cutoff, he's actually 3-betting pretty narrowly, and it looks like a lot for value, and most of his wide 3-betting comes from the small blind and big blind, and even the button. So if this particular player were to 3-bet us from middle position when they were in middle position, and we just looked at this 7% 3-bet, we'd say, oh, this guy's a wide 3-better, and we might continue with a hand range that has us dominated or crushed because we assume this player was again a wide 3-better. And again, another mistake right along those lines, and this will also go into players don't understand how the stats work together, but they make incorrect assumptions based on the stats. Again, if we can see if this player, we look here, and let's say we do use the positional stats, and they say, oh, okay, this particular villain 3-bets the button 5%, they have a pretty wide range. So when we open from under the gun and we get 3-bet, we know that he's 3-betting 5% from the button, which is not super wide, but wide enough that we continue with a wider range. Now, if we look at another stat, this is 3-bet versus position, we can see this player only 3-bets the versus early position players 2% of the time. So if you open from under the gun and this particular player 3-bets you, he's doing it with only a 2% range, which is a value-based range, and hence again, if you call with a wider range thinking that he's 3-betting you light, particularly this particular player, he's going to crush you in that spot because, again, he's only 3-betting for value versus a early position raise. So that's the first big mistake I see players using, is they don't use positional stats, and again, they draw incorrect assumptions based on an overall range and not based on positional and some of the other stats that we just looked at. Another big area that I see players have an issue with is they don't understand how stats work together. So they only use one stat. In that past hand example that we saw, not only did we use 3-bet by position, but again, we saw that that wasn't enough. We also have to use 3-bet versus position. So if we had just used, again, 3-bet by position, we would have come to the wrong conclusion. Real quick, no one stat tells the whole story, and when used together, stats become way more useful and accurate. So, again, if we bring up this hand example here, and we can say, okay, this particular player opens from middle position 16% of the time, and they fold to 3-bets 63% of the time. So now, again, even taking one step further, we can see when they open from middle position, they fold to 3-bets 73% of the time. So first off, a lot of players would say immediately, they would jump to the conclusion that say, oh, this particular player, they only fold 63% of the time, so they're not folding a lot to 3-bets, which again is an assumption, but they really don't know how their opening ranges correlates to folding to 3-bets. So as a real quick, how we can accurately put a player on a range by using stats together. So quickly what we're going to do is we're going to take this player. He opens 16% from middle position, and versus a middle position 3-bet, he folds about 73% of the time. So we're just going to round that up to 75% of the time. So in order to figure out what hand ranges this player is continuing to a 3-bet, now we can say, okay, he opens 16% of the time from middle position, and he folds 75% to a 3-bet. So if we take 16% and multiply that by 0.75, we know that he's continuing with only 4% of his range, or the remaining 25% of his range that he's calling with. So 25% of 16% is 4%. So he knows when he opens from middle position and we 3-bet, he's calling with 4% of his range. This is very important because this will help us to determine whether we're going to be 3-betting for value or we're going to be 3-betting as a bluff. Against a 4% range, we can pretty comfortably 3-bet hands such as queens and ace-king, and we're going to do okay against his range in that situation. Lastly, we're going to look at a lot of the time players use the wrong stat in the wrong spot. They don't understand the difference between stats, and they miss. Okay, so we're going to use the example here of stealing versus 3-betting. If we look at empowered skill here, this villain, and we see his re-steal from the big blind is 10%, yet his 3-bet from the big blind is 7%. Now, so what exactly does that tell us? A lot of villains' opponents would say, again, let's use the example that we opened from under the gun again, and we get 3-bet by this opponent. A lot of players will look at this and say, oh, this particular player is 3-betting 7% from the big blind, and therefore my hand is good against his range, or it's not good against his range. But typically, again, they'll say, they'll use that as an excuse to play a wider range, thinking that this guy's betting 7% from the big blind. But let's take a closer look at this. This particular villain, we see he's actually re-stealing. So he is stealing, he's 3-betting versus a cutoff, button, and small blind opening 10% of the time. So therefore, yet his overall 3-betting from the big blind is only 7%. So in order to find out what he's 3-betting versus early and middle position, we need to do an average calculation here. And this is how we go about doing that. So if we know he's 3-betting 10% from the cutoff, button, and small blind, that's 60% of the positions he's 3-betting, 10% when it's open from there. That means the other 40% of the positions, the early positions, need to add together we need to get 7% overall. So in order to solve for, when we solve for X, we get right around 3% here. So when we average this out, we get about 7% here. Now, what is that telling us? That's basically telling us when this villain 3-bets versus an early or middle position open, they are playing approximately a 3% range. That's significantly different from the 7% range that we see when we pop up here and see that he 3-bets 7% from the big blind. And this is a very, very important factor to understand because, again, there's a big difference between continuing against a 3% range and continuing against a 7% range. And I think that this is a common mistake that many players make by, again, misusing the